Major breaking news, another big win for President Donald Trump over the deep state as a Court of Appeals decision from the D.C. Circuit and a 2-1 decision just shut down $16 billion with a B in climate change grants to be issued supposedly to a bunch of NGO nonprofits. We got to break this down when we come back, but the great news is another win for Trump, another loss for the deep state and their little buddies. Let's talk about it. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the 4 Box of Dine, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say the top voice of the Second Amendment in America. Thank you, 2025 Gundies Awards. All right, folks, a big win for Donald Trump in the case of Climate United Fund versus Citibank and the EPA. The United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, in a 2-1 decision, has just ruled that a dispute over whether or not the EPA, that's the Environmental Protection Agency under Donald Trump, could terminate something on the order of magnitude of $16 billion, that's billion with a B, in climate-related grants under the Joe Biden enacted Inflation Reduction Act, whether or not the EPA under Donald Trump could cancel these contracts, cancel these grants. Well, needless to say, a whole bunch of these nonprofits, NGOs, standing for non-governmental agencies, non-governmental organizations, brought a lawsuit in, of course, the District of Columbia, the home of the deep state, as you know, built on a swamp and a swamp. This lawsuit brought by these NGOs claimed that the Biden administration had awarded them billions of dollars, something on the order of magnitude of $27 billion at one point. And I believe something around 8 nonprofits brought this lawsuit claiming that the Trump administration was shutting off the flow of funds that had been set up by the Biden administration to be placed in escrow, if you will, in trust at Citibank, and then to be doled out over time to these nonprofits, these NGOs. Now, I'm going to digress just very briefly. I look at the Second Amendment movement, and I see the NRA, Second Amendment Foundation, right, Firearms Policy Coalition, Gun Owners of America, and so on. You know, they have millions of dollars with an M, millions of dollars in budgets. And that's great. But none of these organizations have billions with a B of these budgets. My question is, why on earth, how on earth, really, do these sort of left-wing organizations, these nonprofits get set up, and next thing you know, they're getting funded billions of dollars from taxpayer money from the federal government? It's really shocking, and I don't understand how any of this works, but clearly the left in America, they know how to get this done. So anyway, I'm just digressing briefly. But with that said, let's go back to the specifics of this case. So the lawsuit was brought by these NGO, these nonprofit organizations, claiming that billions of dollars were owed to them, and the Trump administration, through the EPA, could not cut this money off. But I'm happy to report in a 2-1 decision, the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit has held that no can do. The lower court, the district court judge in this case, a typical anti-Trump judge, had of course entered an injunction. Surprise, surprise. They just have rubber stamps there that say injunctive relief to be entered against Donald Trump, against the Trump administration. They just need a rubber stamp, right? They hit the rubber stamp and say Trump loses. Right? You can have a rubber stamp in New York City. You can have a rubber stamp in the district courts in Boston, and Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Baltimore, and yes, of course, D.C. And that's what the district court did here. They entered an injunction saying that the Trump administration had to continue to pay this money out the door in the form of these grants to these nonprofits in this case. Well, the good news is the U.S. Court of Appeals has just taken a look at the district court injunction and has concluded, rightly so, yet again, that the injunction entered in favor of the plaintiffs against the EPA that had required the money to continue to flow out the door to these NGOs, to these nonprofits. The Court of Appeals just found that that order of injunctive relief in favor of the plaintiffs was not properly granted. It's now been stayed and shut down, and the preliminary injunction that was entered is now goodbye-bye. And a major reason why this is the case, which is really a no-brainer, we've talked about this before, going all the way back to the early fall or to the early spring of this year, that under the federal Tucker Act, the Tucker Act, if you're suing the federal government for money on a breach of contract claim, or any claim that sounds in, the federal government violated their agreement with you, their contract with you. As a general matter, you have to sue them in a specialized court based in Washington, D.C., called the United States Court of Federal Claims. Well, here, just think about it from a common sense point of view. What are these nonprofit organizations seeking? They want money, right? In the form of these grants. And they're arguing that the federal government had given them this money, had given these grants out during the Biden era. And a lot of these, by the way, were rushed out the door at the end of 2024, right before Trump took office. Wonder why. And now that Trump has turned off the spigot, it turns out they want the money. Okay, you can get the money if you can prove it in court, but what is the theory upon which these nonprofits want the money? Well, the theory is a breach of contract. They're like, we had an agreement with the Biden administration, with the federal government, to give us this money. And now the Trump administration has come in there and taken over the EPA that gave us this money and have taken the money away. The punch bowl has gone away and we want it back. Okay. Well, there's a process for that. It's called sue the federal government in the United States Court of Federal Claims for your money, arguing that they breached the agreement with you. They breached the contract with you. But of course, the reality is for these entities to go to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims is not that favorable of a jurisdiction because it's going to be mostly an even-handed, honest broker kind of court. Because the U.S. Court of Federal Claims is not full of like these left-wing progressive Biden appointees who understand their job is to rubber stamp orders in favor of the left-wing causes in America and to try to throw right-wingers under the bus, conservatives under the bus, libertarians under the bus, January 6ers under the bus. They know their job and they do it well. But that's not a fair court. But going to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims is a fair court with a fair fight for both sides, and that's not what most left-wing litigants want. They want to go to their buddy judges and get a rubber stamped in their favor. And that's why, in my opinion, these nonprofits sued in the United States District Court in D.C., rather than go directly to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. But the good news is the U.S. Court of Appeals here said, no can do. You got to go to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. And that is where this case has now been referred to. And Donald Trump, in a major win, has shut off the spigot of the flow of this money. And maybe 5 or 6 years down the road, if these parties win their cases, well, then maybe they'll get their money. Or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll lose the case. But whatever it is, the injunctive relief that they had won in the lower court is a no-go zone now. This entire case is essentially being dismissed and referred out to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, which is a big win for Donald Trump because, again, the money's not going to go out the door to these left-wing NGOs. Now, with this big win in mind, here's how the court basically started out their opinion, ruling in favor of Donald Trump. The Environmental Protection Agency awarded grants worth $16 billion to 5 nonprofits to promote the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Citing concerns about conflicts of interest and a lack of government oversight, EPA terminated the grants in March of 2025. The grantees sued and the district court entered a preliminary injunction ordering the EPA and Citibank to continue funding the grants. We, however, conclude that the district court abused its discretion in issuing the injunction. The grantees are not likely to succeed on the merits because their claims are essentially contractual, and therefore jurisdiction lies exclusively in the Court of Federal Claims. And while the district court had jurisdiction over the grantee's constitutional claim, that claim is meritless. Moreover, the equities strongly favor the government, which on behalf of the public must ensure the proper oversight and management of this multi-billion-dollar fund. Accordingly, we vacate the injunction. Powerful language there, and it's a no-brainer. If you're suing for breach of contract, you got to go to the Court of Federal Claims. But again, if you think it's a bad court for you, you want to try to stay out of it, you want to go to your buddies in the D.C. Courts there, the same D.C. courts that threw all the January 6ers in prison, right? The same D.C. courts that are going to rule against Trump every single day. That's a very favorable jurisdiction. And if I were representing a bunch of left-wing groups, I would sue there too, frankly. That's good lawyering. But it did not work out in this case because the U.S. Court the U.S. Court of Appeals for D.C. Circuit shut it down. Here's what they had to say about the facts underlying this big fight. This case involves EPA grants awarded under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, for which Congress appropriated $27 billion. In August 2024, the EPA awarded $20 billion to 8 nonprofits pursuant to 2 of the grant programs it created. And then the court opinion goes on to discuss some of these things. Each grant was memorialized in an agreement between the nonprofit and the EPA. The grant agreements have an unusual structure, and then it discusses that structure. Now, of course, what really happened here? Big picture. Joe Biden got his ridiculous Inflation Reduction Act thing, which is really a version of the Green New Deal, which is to give a bunch of money from the taxpayers to the federal government and then have the federal government dole it out to a bunch of NGOs in the name of fighting so-called climate change. We don't need to get into that there, but needless to say, the money spent there, in my opinion, is mostly a bootless exercise for a whole bunch of reasons. But with that said, that was what this was about. So when Trump gets elected, needless to say, people on the left started to freak out, including those presumably who were getting grant money from the federal government in the form of these grants to these various NGOs. So here's what happened according to the court. The sheer scale of the grant program and the method of allocating billions of dollars drew public attention and criticism. The record includes a widely publicized video in which an EPA employee was recorded describing how until recently his role was to make sure proper processes were in place to prevent fraud and to prevent abuse. But after the election of Donald Trump, the EPA was just trying to get the money out the door as fast as possible before they come in and stop it all. The employee compared the situation to throwing gold bars off the Titanic. That's right. Donald Trump gets in. He's going to start cutting funding. The NGOs of the world are going to have problems to the extent they depend upon federal largesse. And obviously, they want to get the money out the door fast before Donald Trump and his team could come in and shut it down. Here's what the court opinion had to say about exactly that. Specifically, how things changed to get the money out the door and stop the team Trump from being able to thwart the spending to shut this down. Check this out. You're not going to believe this. The month before President Trump's inauguration, the EPA modified the grant agreements with no apparent consideration from the grantees to make it more difficult for the government to terminate the grants. The week before the inauguration of Donald Trump, the EPA amended the ACAs, that's the kind of the contract, to require Citibank to continue to disperse funds to these NGO grantees, even if the government exercised its right to exclusive control if the funds are associated with financial obligations properly incurred before the government exercised its right. That's just crazy stuff here, right? So as soon as they knew Trump was coming in, they worked religiously to get the money out the door. And then, right on the eve of inauguration, earlier this year, they made additional changes to the grants to make it harder and harder for the Trump administration to pull back this money or to not pay it in the first place. Just crazy stuff. But anyway, the good news is that the D.C. Court of Appeals here just shut this down and prevented this game from being played and stopped the injunction that required the money to go out the door and said, hey, if you think there's a breach of contract here, if you think this money is owed to you under some agreement, fine. Go sue for breach of contract like millions of people have already done. Go to the U.S. Court of Federal Claims and, 4 or 5 years from now, let's see if you win or maybe you lose. Whatever happens, happens. But again, at least there'll be a fair fight because I can assure you in the district courts in D.C., it ain't going to be a fair fight when it comes to Donald Trump because they all don't like Donald Trump. They hate his agenda, as we've seen time and again with the lawfare that's been deployed against the Trump team and their lawyers as well. So anyway, big win for Trump against the deep state. There are more to come, I suspect, but this is another good one, a big one worth a lot of money. So congratulations to Team Trump. And again, thank you for tuning in here. Make sure you follow me over there on X at For Boxes Diner. And don't forget to subscribe both to YouTube and to Rumble. And I look forward to seeing you again real soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.